Okay, this morning and next week, Debbie and I are going to share. Yeah, we started 2 months ago with the notion of we should report on the trip. I think many people make trips like these. We're including that, but we're looking much more at reflecting on what led us to that trip, what we've read since that trip. In other words, truths and set free, tracking civil rights. I could begin by saying that we need 4 chairs. Here's Bravery. Something we're paying attention to. Okay, so I'm going to move into, we're beginning with a set of quotes that are important to me. And I'm simply going to read the quotes. We're going to come back to them sometime next week too. I simply want you to follow with me. I think everybody has a sheet. And I will just read them through. The first one's a little complicated, the others are very simple. Willful ignorance of what discomforts us may be the most banal of evils, but it eventually leads to all arrest. I just want you to think about that a bit. Banal, not a word we use all the time. It essentially means so ordinary as to be obvious and boring. You know, so willful ignorance of what discomforts us. We do that all the time. Okay, if it's not an important matter, it's probably a good survival technique. But when it is an important matter, it's a serious problem. Willful ignorance of what discomforts us may be the most banal of evils, but it eventually leads to all the rest. I want you to think about that. That quote was inspired by a post by John on Facebook with regard to banning books. And that's exactly the issue. I encourage a friend to try to ban books. Go on record to begin with and say banning books is a really stupid idea. I mean, the book that's been banned in Tennessee shot to #1 in the bestsellers list immediately. It just doesn't work. But anyway, the notion of banning books, which is willful ignorance of what discomforts us, may be the most seeming innocuous of evils, but it eventually leads to all the rest. Okay, here's one that has occurred to me over the course of my readings, and that is no one wants to be made to feel badly about their country. Now, think about that. Everyone needs to think about that. Wherever you fit on the spectrum here, you need to realize that that's an absolute truth. No one wants to be made to feel badly about their country. I mean, and I'm talking about almost anyone in the world. You know, you grow up in a country, you have a certain identity with that country, and no one wants to be made to feel badly about their country. So in the dialogue over civil rights, it's kind of careful that the truth be told, but that we not do that. There's some kind of a mix in there that we need to reach for. And 2 other quotes, truth without love isn't true. And if it doesn't set you free, it's not true. These are chapter titles in this book that I just recently picked up, Shared Bias, Love Matters More, How Fighting to Be Right Keeps Us from Loving Like Jesus. I'll note in passing that Shared Bias is interesting. He's one of the people from the Eastern University crowd, which are spectacular social ethicists. And he's associated with Peter Mims, who is another of the great writers currently in Bible study. And together they have a podcast The Bible for Ordinary People, which I highly recommend. And I'd also give a shout out to Julia's dad, who is a professional advisor, a media advisor, essentially, with regard to this podcast. But just for now, consider the titles. Truth without love isn't true. The longer I live, the more I'm sure that's right. If you're proclaiming the truth as something other than love, there's a pretty good chance you're going to distort it in one direction or another. If it doesn't set you free, it's not true. And I say that as a Christian, and it comes out of my own Christian notion of how it comes to truth. And the final one is all people are people, which I've loved for years. It comes from Jean Bertrand Aristide, a Haitian politician, former president, and I think he hit it when he said, you know, in the middle of everything, in the middle of everything, I mean, a conversation in the kitchen, a conversation in some political forum, a conversation in a church hallway, a thought we have about somebody else, what happens in social media, and how annoying so-and-so has just been. You know, all people are people. You know, just kind of everyone, you know, keep remembering that. We're going to come back to those. What we're doing this morning is I'm going to take 15 more minutes, then turn the last 15, 20 minutes over to Debbie Cash to talk about the trip. And then next week, we'll get into more of the implications or the thought questions. But I want to take this opportunity to do it fairly quickly, but this opportunity to begin this presentation to talk about politics in church. We are part of a tradition that tries very hard not to mix, let's say, politics and the pulpit. That's kind of the distinction we made. That's a choice. Lots of churches do not make that choice. On the right and on the left do not make that choice. We have traditionally made that choice. And so, you know, so I thought I'd, you know, just remind you of my own personal story, that back in the day, all my elders were Republicans. We got along fine. But the point is, we didn't agree about a whole lot of things, but we always respected one another. And we never supposed, anyone remember Kenneth Adams? Okay. Ken and I would have these great conversations, like in rooms like this, community room 1, and it'd be quite clear what he thought, it'd be quite clear what I thought, it'd be a lot of laughter, a lot of clarity on viewpoints, and the viewpoints would get stronger and stronger, but we'd still be laughing. The point is, Ken and I stayed really good friends because it never occurred to him that I had to end up agreeing with him. And it never occurred to me that he had to end up having to agree with me. And we learned a whole lot from him. I mean, I became wiser in my perspective because I was talking to people like Ken Downs, or Bill Cochran, or Bruce Evans. I mean, goodness gracious, he was the CEO of the Foundation of Economic Education, which is a very conservative think tank. But he's one of the most gracious of people. We didn't agree on a whole lot of things, but we really liked him. And that's where we were. Now, I would generally keep it out of the pulpit. For 30 years, I would generally keep it out of the pulpit. In fact, I would do that so rigorously that if I quoted a politician positively in a sermon, you could count on I had not voted for that person. I never told anyone that. But I wanted to make sure they said, well, I don't vote for that person. But I do admire some of the things they say or some of the things they think. And here was a place where I really thought they were onto something. But I mean, I took very seriously keeping it generally out of the pulpit. And the reason it's worked for 35 years or so was we kept it out of elders' meetings. You know, elders' meetings were about taking care of one another, pastoral concerns. They weren't about one elder trying to convince the other elders of a certain political position, until that was violated a few times in the last couple of years. But the reason it worked so well for so long was we were quite respectful about that. So that's where we were. Now, what I would teach and still do teach, and here's just a sample. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. Right back to Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. You would hear that in the Stanford sermon. When an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. Deuteronomy 15, there should be no poor among you. Psalm 146, the Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow. Isaiah chapter 1, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Amos, the whole book of Amos. But take chapter 5, verse 24, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. But for sure, the whole book, talking about justice and matters that currently relate to politics. Amos is filled with the notion of justice and taking care of the poor. Micah 6, verse 8, but what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. The Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is overturning the world's values. It's simply that. It's written at a time when Palestine is on the edge of nationalistic revolt. And living there, we'd probably be with me. Overthrow Rome, overthrow the oppression. And so the Sermon on the Mount, but you know, and I just condensed it to 2. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Or just run through the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are all the opposite of what the world teaches you. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. You know, when did you last read that in political discourse? Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the one that leads off with. Who wants to be that? Jesus says it works, and as far as I can tell, it absolutely does. And almost nothing else does. Matthew chapter 8, Jesus of a Roman centurion. I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Luke chapter 2, the declaration of the angel. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people, but Luke, like Amos, is another of those. Check the whole book out. The whole book has to do with things we deal with every day in the governance of this country and the way we structure our society. It comes up over and over and over again. Certainly the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable or the story of the rich man and Lazarus. It's the whole book. Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 40, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Won't go into that, but it's filled with implications for people today. Acts chapter 10, verse 28. Peter finally reflecting on what the case of Cornelius tells him, but God has shown you that I should not call any person impure or unclean. That's pretty pointed. I should not call any person impure or unclean. God needs to keep showing me that. You know, I think I'm not probably the only one in the room that struggles with that. You know, from just those moments when God has shown me and continues to show me and increasingly shows me that I should not call any person impure or unclean. 1 Corinthians 13, but the greatest of these is love. And 1 John 4:7-21, there's no fear in love, perfect love drives out fear. All of those you would have heard in sermons at the Stanford Church of Christ over and over and over again. Okay, how would we have learned those texts? How did we best understand them? So I'm just going to remind you, you should come up with the three right words here. I'm going to coach you on it. In historical context. In historical context. I mean, if you're talking about the poor of the land, you do need to have some sense of what the biblical writers would have meant by the poor of the land. And you should have some sense of what we mean by the poor of the land. There's going to be overlap. There's definitely going to be application, but it might not be one-to-one application. So it's always in historical context. But here, back to my personal story. In more recent years, any teaching related to ethics, morals, or justice, some view and dismiss as politics. That's something the last 4 or 5 years. You know, maybe we were building toward it, but it's really in the last few years that any teaching related to ethics, morals, or justice, some view and dismiss as politics. And they have their reasons. Sometimes they're not so bad, sometimes they're pretty bad. But the point is, when that happens, when you can't talk about ethics, morals, and justice in the church, first of all, where would you talk? You know, if it's not in the church. And then look what you've done. You've silenced the church in the matters that relate most to how society governs and structures itself. And you're basically saying Christians as Christians have no particular viewpoint on how a society governs and structures itself. Theoretically, that might sound right, but a whole lot of people are getting hurt because of how a society governs or structures itself. A Christian has to have thoughts on that. They don't have to agree on the faults. They have to agree on people are hurting and what might we do about it. You know, that's what we have to agree on. And the prophetic witness of the church is lost, and with it, much of its relevance. The general guidelines, when we're talking about politics in the church, I think what we really need is no partisan politics. I don't get up and endorse a candidate. I don't get up and endorse a party. No moral issues politicized. You stick to the moral issues. You don't politicize it, but you do say it. You have to say it. You know, in that sense, there's always politics in the pulpit, always has been politics in the pulpit, because politics is the way we structure ourselves. It's just that. And so if sermons can, you know, never touch that, then they're only half good at very best. And there are other matters of personal piety and other things that are important too. But the other point is primarily allegiance to the kingdom of God. That is what Christians give. It's the kingdom of God, not any nation. Not any nation. You know, the primary allegiance. How about the primary allegiance? Your affection for a country, patriotism, so on and so forth. But that's separate than your primary allegiance. And in this room, among us, the primary allegiance is to the kingdom of God. One other point I'll make, and then I'm ready to turn it over to Debbie. And that is that the church has got to allow for diversity of thought within it. It has to allow diversity of thought within it. And sometimes people miss that. Maybe back in the old days where we thought everyone could think alike and everything. Well, then of course you think exactly like me, because we have to think exactly the same thing. We're kind of past that. You know, people think for themselves and they don't come up with the same conclusions. And that's okay. Diversity of thought is a great thing. We find it in Scripture. Now think back to the church at first. What do you think their view of Rome was? That's political. You know, they all agreed Rome was great. Well, Cornelius might have, and other Roman centurions might have. Matthew probably didn't. Any number of people didn't. Okay, they all agreed Rome was peaceful. No. Tremendous diversity of thought. Whether it was better to be Greek or Roman. And we don't think about that a whole lot now, but the Greeks were pretty sure they were still superior to the Romans and could make that peace. So there'd be strong views on whether you were Hellenizing or Latinist, or Jewish, or food laws. I mean, read the scriptures themselves. There's diversity of thought over and over and over again. And my point would be, if diversity of thought is not honored and respected within the church, where will it be? Where is it better handled? Where is it better processed? Where is it better worked through, except in places where grace and love and respect offer? You know, do you know another arena where it should work better? No, I'm saying the history of churches, no. I mean, it doesn't work all that great in church. It should work best in churches. Churches that are following Jesus, it should work best. Okay, Debbie.
Morning, everyone. So all this began for us, well, everything begins way beyond, but recently, when Kimbo invited us to be a part of something that is known as the whiteness studies. And that began for her when she got involved with a larger project by another church, not the church she attends, but Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte. So she participated in the same study, and then she was trained as a trainer. And then she invited numbers of people to come participate. And these were all Zoom lessons, Zoom meetings. We met together 7 afternoons, hour and a half. And there was this curriculum, and you'll see that at the back of your papers. And so those largely were readings to be done, essays. Most of the readings could have been done usually with half an hour to an hour time. And then there were various movies. Those who not liking to read, the movies were great to kind of get a perspective on the topics that we covered each week. So mostly the meetings were about reflecting our own personal history and our particular relationship to racism. Like, what did we think of the other races when we were children? What was our exposure? What was our first thought of people different than us? And then what shaped us in our thoughts and processes throughout and currently in our lives now. So we were very interested in seeing how it is that what impacts our relationships with those who are not like us. Everybody in the class was white, and that was the point of it. And so we got to know each other and talked very frankly with each other through these Zoom meetings. I'll just point out a couple pieces of the series that Gail and I particularly liked. We had heard of James Baldwin. Neither one of us had read much of his work, and found it to be a wonderful writer. He was very compelling, and he just kind of lays bare the truth of the Black experience, but always with a touch of humor, sadness, and yet there's hope. So he blends all this up, so it's very, very interesting readings. And then in the movies, the one that kind of stood out to me was When They See Us, at Ava DuVernay, producer of that. It's a 5-part docudrama, and you can see it on Netflix. And it involves the stories of Central Park 5. Remember those back in the 80s? There were 5 young teens who we thought of as a gang. They didn't even know each other. Like, a couple knew each other, but as a group, they did not even know each other. But they were accused and then arrested. And during the arrest process, they were subjected to basically torture techniques. And they were teenagers, like 14, 15, one was 17, but most were very young. And they basically were tortured until they told the detectives what the detectives wanted to hear. And then they were prosecuted on the basis of these 4 confessions. And then they get sent to prison. And so the story kind of follows their life in prison, and then what happens to them afterwards in their lives. I found this personally enlightening because at the time of the trial, I was something of a fan of Linda Fairstein. Does everybody remember her at all? She's the prosecutor that the New York Manhattan Department had set up to address sexual assault crimes. And at the time, I was working at the Rape Crisis Center at Stanford. So I thought, wow, this Linda Fairstein is really a powerful person doing the work of justice. And after seeing this movie, I was like, I don't think I have the right perspective on that. So I'm beginning to think, no, there's some sense of tremendous racism that was at the problem of this criminal processing. The rape victim was certainly brutalized. She was assaulted, and by another person, but not by these, these 5 young men who never had met her, but by a person who later confessed to this crime while in prison for other sexual assaults, which then eventually led to the release of these 5 who now live or have died with tremendous PTSD following the brutal treatment in prison. So it's a really a strong look at the justice system from the point of arrest to prosecution, sentencing, trials, prison experiences, and what happens to a person post-prison, which has been something I'm particularly interested in now. In the state of Connecticut, there is a law that's we're trying to get passed that would stop use of solitary confinement in our prisons in Connecticut, or at least greatly reduce the usage of such. And I'm involved with that largely because I feel like that is a part of a way that we can visit those who are in prison. That's Christ instructed us to do. So anyway, the whiteness studies constantly led me to think about the question of who holds power, who is powerless, and why these patterns exist and continue to exist. It also led me to think about how Black people live in fear of white people, that Black people have consistently lived with from the time of slavery, the Jim Crow era, to the fear of lynching, the fear of homes being burned, homes being bombed at the hands of the KKK and others, segregation and arrest when any of the minute details of manners were crossed. And then the fear, or recently, the fear of arrest and incarceration and what that would mean to these people. So out of these experiences, I have become more conscious of how brave Black people have to be to live among us white people. How is it they come to worship with us, to be in relationship with us, of us who I'm referring to as those of us who see ourselves as white. Therefore, I don't think some of you were at Norma's funeral, and I made some remarks about how brave it was for people back in the 70s, early 80s, to integrate the largely white-led church. At the funeral reception, I found out from Norma's brother, Larry, that Larry bought his home, where he currently lives, close to Ridgeway Center, in his late 70s, and Norma and her son lived there in that home. It's like a 2-family house. But there was a petition in their neighborhood before they bought the house, demanding that this house not be sold to Black people. So that was just as Dale and I were arriving here at Stanford. The petitions were circulated in the neighborhood, but they were able to they were successful in buying their home. So after they successfully bought the home, his children and Norma's son were instructed to be especially quiet and polite to all the people in the neighborhood who didn't want them there. So that's the kind of experience that our people that we know and love have been through, more actually rather recently. So if you might still be interested in participating in these whiteness studies, they are being offered every few months, and you could join. Just contact us. So in early November, a conference was held for all the people who had participated in one of these many new whiteness study groups. Because of COVID numbers quite low, we decided to go to this weekly conference and to visit with Timbo. After that, we then traveled on to cities where there were major events in terms of civil rights for Black people, which was a 5-hour drive to Atlanta and a few more hours on into Birmingham, a couple hours to Selma, and even less time to Montgomery. So fairly close to one another. So when we got to Atlanta, except for gift shops, museums, churches, and homes that we would typically visit, and which we were looking forward to visit, were actually closed because of COVID. So we didn't get to go into some of the places we could hope to do. But we were able to visit some of the places. They had some wonderful outdoor memorial displays that were meaningful and instructive. Especially, there was one on the 6 principles of nonviolence. And these principles form a network of foundational truths. For instance, nonviolence seeks the defeat of injustice, not people. So again, just as Gail was talking about, it's not about using our voice against a person, but against injustices as they exist. Because we didn't get to spend time in churches and museums, we had a beautiful afternoon opened up to us, and we decided to go see what all the excitement was about around Stone Mountain, which is the most popular tourist destination in Georgia. And it is beautiful. It's a beautiful park, lake setting. It's like kind of like Central Park. It's just gorgeously laid out and beautiful, built around this geologically unusual stone protrusion mountain, the Stone Mountain. Very unusual. So this park opened in the early 1900s because of financial problems and disputes with Guts and Borglum. Does everybody know that Guts and Borglum just lives like 2 blocks over here? So there's a Guts and Borglum Lane just off the Blair Mill. So it's just he was one of our previous neighbors in this area. But he also was a KKK supporter. And as you might know him, more famously, that he was the carver of Mount Rushmore. He's got Mount Rushmore, being our neighbor, but he was also asked to work on the carvings that then became a sculpture on Stone Mountain. They fell into all sorts of problems, financial and so forth, so he didn't do that. I just thought that was an interesting fact since he was from here. So there was this sculpture that was designed, in a little start of it, of the 3 Confederate heroes, Lee, Jackson, and Davis. And it wasn't finished, though, until 1972. So it started in the early 1900s. It was finished in 1972. When it was in response to the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. Money now was easily found to complete it. So just think about the need of that we couldn't complete it, but once the Civil Rights Act was making the legislation, the country, there was parts of the country was ready to pour money into honoring these Confederate leaders. So, and now there's some popular laser and light show that's, but it wasn't running due to COVID, but it is quite popular. So from Atlanta, we went on to Birmingham, and there are several, a lot of things to do in Birmingham. First of all, is the 16th Street Baptist Church, which probably you're most familiar with. That's where there were 4 young girls, like 12 and 13-year-old girls, that were killed there at church that morning when the church was bombed. It was amazing that not more people were hurt that time. So we did a tour of the church, was several hours. Across the street is a lovely, well-done museum. We spent several hours there. And then the next day, we did a 3-hour tour of the city of Birmingham, which gave us a perspective, a little broader perspective as well. And that was a great play tours. And I'd say the tour director was a fabulous teacher. So there were so many pieces of detail that we learned, like just how restrictive and newly so were the local laws against social interactions between the races. So if I had known Laconia and we sat down to play checkers, we would have been breaking the law and he would have been possibly gone to prison. It was like breaking the law, but he would have gone to prison for playing checkers or dominoes or any other social thing. Obviously, we would not have eaten together in a restaurant in those days, but it also would have been illegal for me to invite him to my home and have him speak with me for dinner. Now, if he was acting as a butler or as a cook, that would have been different. But if we were just going to have a social gathering, a barbecue in the backyard, he would have been in trouble. So these laws became more restrictive at this time period, and they might not have been quite as restrictive. At least there wasn't laws written against them earlier, but in the 50s and 60s, laws started to be written that were that strict. And we probably all heard of poll taxes. One of the things I learned about poll taxes is, at least in that area, each state had a different rules and each state had different laws around those things. But so in Alabama, poll taxes were established in 1901, and the cost was $1.50 to vote, not to register, but every time you voted, it cost you $1.50. In 1901, that would be about asking you to pay $40 or $50 to vote every time. Now, on top of that, if you missed your voting, if you're 21 and you're eligible to be registered and you're eligible to vote and you don't, then you get charged, and that's approved. So let's say what you were voting this year, it wasn't convenient to get to vote, but there wasn't a cause that you were that excited about, so you didn't go and vote. So the next election, there was somebody there that really wanted to vote for it. And so if you go to vote, not only do you have to pay your $1.50, you had to pay the $1.50 the time you didn't vote. So now, say you have to pay $90 to vote. And then if you missed another election, it'd be another improvement. So there'd be a point, if you hadn't voted for a period of time, it'd be impossible really to financially to vote. So it was not only a detriment to Black people, but obviously a detriment to the poor white people as well. So, so it really was a way to establish, maintain power within the wealthy white people. So that was a detail that I had not read before. Another thing that really struck us was the bravery of deep faith that we saw in the stories that we heard. There was a Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth that I was not particularly familiar with. He lived in a rectory, which is right next to the church, not near as close as this house is to the church, but like there's like a space of about maybe 6 feet between the church and their home. And on Christmas Day in 1956, his wife, one of his children was in the hospital, and his wife was with the child in the hospital. There was 2 other children at home, and Reverend Shuttlesworth was on the side of the house that was closest to the church, and so someone put a bomb in between their home and the church, and children were on the far side, so the house didn't crumble around the children, but it did collapse around Fred, and they thought for sure he died, and people had gathered around the explosion and to see what was going on. But in a bit, he walked out, smoldering collapsed remains, essentially unharmed. And then he continued, and his home was bombed. Another home that was bombed. He and his wife were both beaten and stabbed when they tried to integrate the children into the local high school. And that's videotaped, and one can see how, I forget, I have to look at it to see where you can see it, but it's definitely historical fact. So his integration of Black children in local high school was another accomplishment. And the bravery it takes, I think, to do something like that, knowing that you're going to be physically harmed. So after Birmingham, we went to Selma, we crossed the bridge. So after seeing film footage of the historical walk across the bridge and the brutal beatings that followed, it was an honor to take that same walk. And with all those images in mind. Then we took the drive along the same road toward Montgomery that thousands walked to gain the right to vote. We imagined what it might have been like on that multi-day walk that took us only a few hours in an air-conditioned car. But others that came out from their homes and shared water and food along the way, and we thought about those that offered shelter to the multitude looking to secure the right to vote. And then we were into Montgomery. That was our last stop. So Montgomery is the home to the Southern Poverty Law Center, to the Equal Justice Initiative, Legacy Museum, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is sometimes referred to as the Lynching Memorial, and a number of other justice-oriented organizations. Montgomery is the centerpiece of justice at this stage in their history. The easy place to start to know all of this history is to get to know Brian Stevenson. Brian is a Harvard-trained defense attorney. He's focused on death row cases. He's won about 135 of those cases, and particularly cases involving children and death row or long life sentences. He's an author of both Just Mercy and the movie by that name. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, the memorial, which is sometimes called the Lynching Memorial, the Lynching Museum, and then the Legacy Museum. So he is an amazing person. He also now teaches courses at NYU Law School around these issues. And I must say the Legacy Museum is by far the best educational, not art focused, but best educational museum I've ever been in. And we didn't see all of it, and couldn't spend more hours there. Montgomery is also home of Rosa Parks and the well-known bus boycott in the 50s. So I thought of an interest, and I just want to leave you this image. The place where she got on the bus, did not give up her seat, was at the center of Montgomery, and there's several streets come together. There's a circle. That circle was historically the place that slaves were auctioned. Think of this spot that slaves are auctioned for many, many years and sold and debased and humiliated. And she, many years later, is the one that stands up and says, "No, I'm going to sit on the bus." And then eventually, just before that, they built a beautiful water fountain. It's a sculpture, water fountain. It's a beautiful piece of artwork. Now, on that spot, that used to be the spot where they sold the slaves, and just right there where her bus stop was just right by this beautiful sculpture. Today, if you go there, around the base of the sculpture, there's a sidewalk, and on it says, in blocks, letters, Black Lives. So I like to circling of that. So I'm going to leave that with that. I think we're well out of time. And I have to go to church. So we'll see you next week to hear a bit more of this.
Thank you.